The Russian Anarchists and Kropotkin by Maurice Brinton. This is a book review of Paul Avrich's The Russian Anarchists, published by Princeton University Press in 1967. And holy shit, did anybody just hear that stomach growl? It was intense. Okay, let me get my phone situated. Alright, here we go. Let's fucking get this party started. This book was to be expected. What was not expected is that it should turn out quite readable. It is a serious attempt to rescue the Russian anarchists from the realms of demonology and myth to which they have been relegated for several decades by the combined malevolence of bourgeois and Bolshevik historians, and by the uninformed panegyrics of their own supporters. Traditional historians, whether of the, quote, right or, quote, left, tend to view all history through the eyes of the victors. They worship the established fact. For them, only the real is rational. Defeated dissidents, dynamiters, dreamers, and demagogues are wrong almost by definition. The trouble starts when one looks at the fruits of the, quote, rationality, end quote, that triumphed. Bolshevism emerged victorious from the great battlefield of conflicting interests, from the great cauldron of hopes and aspirations that was the Russia of 1917. But today, 50 years later, what do we see? Quote, Marxism, end quote, being used to justify some of the worst tyrannies in history. Quote, socialist, end quote, states which resemble their bourgeois counterparts not only in their deepest essence, the hierarchical relationship of rulers to ruled, the authoritarian pattern of industrial management, etc., but also in many of their superficial trappings. It is hardly surprising that there should be a resurgence of interest in other, more libertarian strands of revolutionary thought and action. A factual framework is needed for this alternative vision of ends and means. It is here that Avrich's book proves useful. The author does not attempt a serious sociological analysis of the various strands of Russian anarchism. What he does is to survey the field as a whole without digging too deep into any particular area. The author is not a revolutionary. He patronizingly dismisses the deepest of working-class aspirations, that for freedom in production, as a quest for an obviously unattainable golden age. He does, however, provide enough factual material to justify a reappraisal of many current views as to what happened in 1917 and immediately after. For far too long, most revolutionaries have had an extremely one-sided view of the history of the Russian Revolution. Events have all been perceived and assessed through the deforming prism of Bolshevism. Those educated in this school really know very little about some of the cardinal issues. All they know, for instance, about Russian, quote, economism, end quote, and about, quote, its lack of program and perspective, end quote, is through Lenin's scathing strictures in What is to be Done. Average will broaden their outlook. If they have ever heard of Mahaisky. I read an article about Mahaisky one time. I think he's about, his whole deal is about the intellectual division of labor and how that produces hierarchies within ostensibly emancipatory movements. But I'm not sure. Let's read on. If I'm right, you owe me $1 million. If they have ever heard of Mahaisky and of his forebodings that Marxism would turn out to be the ideology of a new aristocracy based on nationalized property, an aristocracy of managers, administrators, technical experts, and professional politicians which would rule, while manual workers remained enslaved by those whose, quote, capital, end quote, was the specialized knowledge needed to operate in a complex industrial economy, it would only have been through references in Trotsky's autobiography or through Trotsky's polemical writings of 1939 and 1940, claiming that Russia was still a, quote, workers' state, end quote. Again, Avrich will tell them more. So that was pretty right, yeah. The specialized knowledge needed to operate a complex industrial economy. That was their capital. God, I'm so fucking smart. Traditional Marxists will doubtless have heard of polemics waged by both Bolsheviks and Mensheviks against the terrorist anarchists of Cherno, Znamia, and Bezhnakali. They may have heard of the retorts that Marx's disciples included hordes of intellectuals, quote, bent on drowning the will to act in a mighty torrent of words, end quote, or, quote, spending their time in libraries studying and writing about predetermined revolutions, end quote. But few will know that some of the most telling arguments against the flamboyantly heroic but incorrigibly romantic terrorists to whom Average devotes excessive attention, came from such early Russian anarcho-syndicalists as Daniel Novomirsky and the group around him in Odessa. The average communist or Trotskyist is understandably allergic to Kropotkin and to his notions that, quote, cooperation rather than conflict is at the root of the historical process, end quote, a cooperation that clearly transcends the barriers of class. But is he aware, the average communist or Trotskyist aware, of the hostility engendered within anarchist ranks against this, quote, genteel anarchism, end quote, whose, quote, nostalgic yearning for a simpler but fuller life, end quote, led Kropotkin to idealize the autonomous social units of a bygone age. Maximov, the most sane and serious of the anarcho-syndicalists, might have had Kropotkin in view when in 1918 he scorned the Manilovs in the anarchist communist camp of, quote, romantic vision as quote romantic visionaries who pined for pastoral utopias, oblivious to the complex forces at work in the modern world, end quote. Average provides interesting information on the role of the anarchist in the Russian Revolution itself, but in rather a haphazard and anecdotal manner, as the author does not himself seem to appreciate the cardinal significance of some of the writings he is talking about. He discusses almost in passing the phenomenal growth of the factory committees during 1917 and early 1918 and the sustained and concerted drive of the Bolsheviks to incorporate them in the structure of the unions, the better eventually to emasculate them altogether. He tells of Lenin's creation as early as December 1917 of the Vyshenka Supreme Economic Council, one of whose main functions was to absorb the All-Russian Council for Workers' Control, thereby seeking to stem the syndicalist tide. Few traditional Marxists will have heard of the great debates that took place in January 1918 at the first All-Russian Congress of Trade Unions on the question of the control of industry, workers' control versus state control, or of the even more fundamental debate on workers' control versus workers' management. Footnote, unfortunately, few modern syndicalists seem to have heard of it either. End footnote. Many will be surprised to learn that at this Congress, the Bolsheviks were supported by the SRs and Martov and the Menshevik delegates, one of whom deplored that, quote, an anarchist wave in the shape of factory committees and workers' control was sweeping over the Russian labor movement, end quote. At this Congress, the Marxist scholar Ryazanov, a recent convert to Bolshevism, if not to the realities of industrial labor, advised the factory committees to, quote, commit suicide, end quote, by becoming a, quote, integral element, end quote, of the official trade union structure. Most communists or Trotskyists will be amazed to learn, as was the present reviewer, that by the beginning of 1921, Lenin had become so alarmed at the revival of syndicalist tendencies among the factory workers and intellectuals of his own party that he placed on the index the works of Fernand Pelloutier, an important figure of the French syndicalist movement. I don't know what placing someone on the index means. On all these matters, Average's book brings a mass of well-documented, if only half-digested material of exceptional interest and relevance, most of it culled from original Russian sources. Finally, the book does not degenerate into an uncritical apologia of, quote, anarchism, end quote, of the kind that does much harm to the libertarian cause. It is not in the tradition of so much anarchist writing, which is more concerned in commemorating than in understanding. Throughout, the Russian anarchists are discussed in a ruthlessly demystified manner. We are told of the muddle-headed Bakunin correctly denouncing the idea that a tiny band of conspirators could carry out a coup d'etat in the interest of the people as, quote, a heresy against common sense and historical experience, end quote. Yet determined to create his own, quote, secret society, end quote, of conspirators whose members would be subject to the, quote, strictest discipline, end quote, and subordinated to a, quote, small revolutionary directorate, end quote, a directorate which was to remain intact even after the revolution in order to forestall the establishment of a, quote, official dictatorship, end quote. We are reminded of the, quote, anarcho-patriots, end quote, who, as late as 1916, were still supporting the first imperialist war in the name of anarchist, quote, principles, end quote. The famous, quote, Manifesto of 16, end quote, was signed by, quote, some of the most eminent anarchists in Europe, end quote. Men like Kropotkin, Ferlam, Cherkezov, Jean Grave, Charles Malato, Christian Cornelissen, James Guillaume, and others. I don't know if I pronounced those names correctly. Average also tells us how many prominent anarchists became supporters of the Bolshevik regime. Some, like Alexander Gay, became high officials in the Cheka, anarcho-compers. Others, like Iuda Roshin, formerly prominent in the Cherno Znamia terrorist movement, decided that theory was important after all, and evolved, quote, an anarchist theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. Yet others, like the Gordin brothers, erstwhile contributors to the virulently anti-Bolshevik paper Burevestnik, the Stormy Petrel, came to support the Bolsheviks, seeing in them apostates from the Marxist creed because of their voluntarism and constant emphasis on the role of revolutionary will, which was taken to imply a break with the categories and theories of economic determinism. One of the Gordin brothers eventually became a Protestant missionary, the other the founder of the Jewish Ethical Society. Throughout, Average emphasizes the, quote, congenital inability, end quote, of the anarchists to subordinate personal differences to the good of the movement. He stresses their tendency to personalize their ideological quarrels, many of which were centered on essentially abstract matters. Then, as now, they produced few ideas but many words. Then, as now, the words meant all things to all men. Then, as now, quote, anarchism, end quote, could accommodate people on both sides of the barricades. Only some of the syndicalists emerge as capable of discussing ideas coherently and of intervening meaningfully in real areas of struggle. They, of course, were not paralyzed by the organization phobia that afflicted all other libertarian tendencies. In the next issue of Solidarity, L.S. of Aberdeen objected. Okay, so I guess that's the end of the review, and then here's a response to the review. Although I have no particular wish to defend a, quote, apostolic succession, end quote, of anarchist thought, I feel I must question the side comment on Kropotkin and Maurice Brinton's review. The reference is to Kropotkin's, quote, notions that, quote, cooperation other than conflict is at the root of the historical process, end quote. A cooperation that clearly transcended the barriers of class, end quote. The parenthetical assumption is inaccurate and does no justice to Kropotkin's thought. His theory of mutual aid applied to evolution rather than to the stages of historical development, and is opposed to the idea of, quote, survival of the fittest, end quote, an aspect of Darwinism that has proved its usefulness to fascist theoreticians, rather than to Marxist concepts of class struggle. Kropotkin believed that groups cooperating successfully, not the strong preying on the weak, tended to survive. In primitive societies, there would be no question of cutting across class barriers, and when class conflicts arose at a later stage, few socialists could dispute that organization in a cooperative manner becomes essential for the insurgent classes if they are to overthrow their oppressors and survive. The extent to which Kropotkin was aware of the nature and potency of class conflict in history is manifest in his volume on the Great French Revolution, a massive work in which a solidarist could certainly pick out evidence of, quote, muddle-headedness, end quote. It nevertheless gives a comprehensive and supremely class-conscious account of events from the first stirrings of the revolution in the 1780s to the, quote, triumph of reaction, end quote, in Thermidor in 1794. The description of bourgeois methods using workers and peasants against king and nobles, then turning to repression is The description of bourgeois methods using workers and peasants against king and nobles, then turning to repression if popular movements threaten to get out of their control, is probably unequaled in the historiography of the French Revolution, and Kropotkin's constant unequivocal sympathy with the betrayed, defeated, and still oppressed people is anything but, quote, genteel, end quote. And Maurice Brinton replied, Kropotkin's theory of, quote, mutual aid, end quote, may or may not be a more plausible interpretation of the facts of biological evolution than Darwin's theory of, quote, natural selection through the survival of the fittest, end quote. This has little to do, however, with the main issue, namely whether Kropotkin's theory has any relevance to the understanding of the historical process, i.e. to human history. Kropotkin himself certainly believed his concepts of, quote, mutual aid, end quote, were relevant to sociology as well as to biology. L.S. seems in two minds on this point. She first states that Kropotkin's theory of mutual aid applies, quote, to evolution rather than to stages of historical development, end quote, but then proceeds to give examples clearly drawn from the realm of sociology. In my opinion, the sociological relevance of Kropotkin's theory is limited to relations within a class. He vividly describes the sense of solidarity within certain social groups. The concept clearly does not apply to the struggle between classes, and since the days of slavery, class struggle has been a constant feature of human history. Unlike most animal species, the genus Homo sapiens has from an early stage been divided into classes, these being determined by the relations men come into with other men in the course of economic life. The class struggle, and not, quote, mutual aid, end quote, between classes, has molded the face of history. Did Kropotkin's ideas of, quote, cooperation, end quote, transcend the class barriers? In the ultimate test of Kropotkin's own political life, they clearly did, but they did so in his early writings too. These are full of, quote, sweet reason, end quote, rather than anger. His aim is to convince and reason with, rather than to overthrow, those who oppress the masses. He did not really understand the class struggle. In mutual aid, he could decry, quote, the teachings of mutual hatred and pitiless struggle which came, adorned with the attributes of science, from obliging philosophers and sociologists, end quote. The book receives rave notices in the journals of the Victorian establishment. It is no accident that so many of Kropotkin's supporters today are either pacifists or anarchists of the, quote, back to the simple country life, end quote type. There is, in all this, an internal coherence. It is true, as L.S. says, that Kropotkin's book, The Great French Revolution, reveals the, quote, extent to which Kropotkin was aware of the nature and potency of class conflict in history, end quote. But this assertion is double-edged. The major work analyzing the tremendous upheaval from a class point of view remains Daniel Guérin's La lutte des classes sous la Première République, published in Paris in 1946. This outstanding work contains a brilliant analysis of the historiographies of the French Revolution, from conservatives such as Thiers via liberals such as Michelet, incidentally much admired by Kropotkin, down to Stalinists such as Malaise. Of Kropotkin, Guérin, now an anarchist, says, quote, just like Jaurès, the social democrat, Kropotkin, the libertarian, has not entirely freed himself from modes of thought inherited from bourgeois democracy, end quote. Kropotkin's failing is hardly inspiring. At a time when the understanding of history was being revolutionized, he could make the inane statement that, quote, modern socialism has added absolutely nothing to the ideas that were circulating among the French people between 1789 and 1794, end quote. There is nothing as painful as getting to grips with new ideas, or as supplementing emotion with understanding. Anarchists' abstentionism in both these areas seems, alas, to be as old as the hills. Solidarity, Volume 4, Issues 11 and 12, March and January of 1968.